A lot of what you're doing, though, here is if you kind of get in your heart what that longer-term vision is. So for us, it's 5,000 baptisms by 2032 and send 500 people out, right? I think when people hear that, people could just be like, okay, well, that just needs to be your goal, right? You just need baptism goals and like sent goals. And it's like, no, what you got to do is like, okay, let's think about, man, 10 years from now, if that actually were going to happen, what
would have happened?
What are some other things that would have, and it's like
happened along the way?
Yeah, there probably is like, man, these big organizational changes that are going to happen, and like, there's going to be financial stuff, right? That's going to, people are going to have to buy into the vision, and the vision's going to have to be clear, and that's a lot of what you're doing in this exercise. You're kind of reverse engineering and saying, like, going back to the very beginning where I was like driving across the country, right? Like you're basically saying, man, if I'm going to drive all the way across the country, like at day 2 or day 3, you're going to have to be able to say, hey, I made some progress, right? I hit Texas at some point, I hit Arizona at some point. That's kind of what you're doing with this.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Andrew. This is Pastor Bobby. If you're new to the Breaking Barriers podcast, we are it's a ministry that is all about trying to help churches grow so that they can go. We want to see disciples made from here, everywhere, all the way to the ends of the earth. And we really believe that the fastest way that that's going to happen is if churches are growing, if they are gaining in the number of disciples from their communities that are being grown in their churches. We often say at Mercy Hill and with the Breaking Barriers podcast that churches can grow without going, but they can't go without growing. And maybe, I don't want to overspeak, but one of the most vital pieces of that is having vision that ends up translating down into execution. And Pastor Bobby and I started a discussion last week where we're talking about how that vision that we have long-term for our church ends up trickling down. And we're going to eventually in this podcast get all the way to the point of, man, how it looks week to week with executing to get us all the way there. But as we get going on that, Bobby, if you want to kind of recap where we were and then pick back up today, we're going to be jumping some more into kind of that 3-year, 1-year, 90-day world.
Yeah. So we're talking about how to plan for the upcoming year and then how to execute on those plans. And, I think the Bible talks a ton about this sort of stuff. Obviously we have verses like, man, without the vision, the people are going to perish. And then we see just a ton of leadership stuff throughout the Bible. I think about Moses, and his father-in-law coming to him, and what he was responsible for had grown, and he was trying to kind of do it all himself. And his father-in-law was like, "Hey, man, this is how you need to break this stuff up. Like you got to lead in a different way because of what you're responsible for now." And a lot of this, like, yearly planning and 3-year vision and 10-year vision, that's what it's about. We're trying to, obviously God does the spiritual work, but he doesn't kind of go around us. He uses pastors, he uses people using their gifts. That's what the church is all about. God wants to use us. And so like, man, we're part of it, like we're participating in what God is doing. And so that's why we do planning, and that's why we do goal setting. And sometimes we're not going to hit those goals, and we just got to thank God for whatever he does in our midst. But we got to do our best to, try to plan and try to create organizational plans. And so this last episode that we just did, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to it if you haven't. We talked about, what are the things that you need to do going into the upcoming year to plan for what are some of the things we're going to focus on this year. And so what we hit in that last episode is, before you get into planning for the upcoming year, one, you got to review what happened in the previous year. Sometimes if there's certain things that just didn't go well, you just don't even want to think about them. You're like, man, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. If I don't see them, if I don't think about them, if I don't see what those numbers are, then I just don't gotta. It's like, okay, that's not the best thing. You need to engage that stuff. And then, look at those things where God really blessed and, man, things went the way you were hoping for. And then after that, before you're getting into the plans for the upcoming year, you need to be thinking about what the longer term vision is, because if you're thinking about like aiming way out far ahead, whether that's 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, you got to have that to kind of know where you're driving. You think about like, hey, if you're driving all the way across the United States, right? It's like, man, There's lots of different ways that you can go. Actually, you know, when you're going on a journey that far, 3,000 miles or something, there's lots of different ways you can go. But generally, if you're driving east to west, most of the time you need to be heading west, right? I mean, you could take the southern route, you could take the right through the middle of the country route, but in general, you need to be going towards the west because your long-term destination is the west. And having a longer-term vision, that's all it's about, right? It's like, man, there's going to be 10 different pathways to get to that 5-year or 10-year vision, but you do need that kind of North Star vision. And so if you didn't listen to that episode, go back, listen to that. Today, we're going to be talking about like, okay, once you have some of that longer term vision set, how do you get kind of a closer to us vision? And then how do you get like hey, what are we hoping to do in the upcoming year? Right. And so what we did in that 2-day planning that we just did with our leadership team is we talked a lot about, man, what do we want to see happen in 3 years? And I think this 3-year exercise is, you know, it's very much like, hey, just like, let's throw out some specific things. Like, hey, we want this specific thing to happen. Or some of them are just like, this is kind of who we want to be 3 years from now. It's not as like objective and tangible.
Right.
It's really just like, hey, let's just do an exercise of, and I remember the first time we ever did this exercise, I think our leadership team listed 40 things that we wanted to see in 3 years. Maybe just kind of talk about like what that looks like, what that feels like, because it's not just like we want this specific thing, but it's kind of like what's it going to feel like 3 years from now?
Yeah,
you know, if God continues to bless our church and our
well,
ministry.
I think it takes a lot of thought work. Honestly, I mean, I think that people might think, oh, I can just spit that stuff out, and they probably can spit like 3 or 4 things out that may be kind of good, maybe, or they may not be. But to really drill down and get to in our planning process, what we are trying to do is get 15 things that define what that better future looks like 3 years from now. That keeps us on track for the 10-year. You know, I just think it takes a lot of thought work, you know, to really start thinking about all the different facets of your ministry. You know, where are things probably naturally going to be, so that you can then set higher goals on top of those things. You know, it can feel like when you're starting to set some goals for that 3 year that you're just throwing darts at a board, that, you know, you're making this stuff up out of thin air, but that's really not true. Like if you're starting to think about how many baptisms you want to have, you know, you're going to need to get kind of granular on, well, how many first time guests do we think we could have? You know, I mean, you got to do that kind of work and then go in and say, we want to stretch that number a little bit and make it God-sized. So that there's, I guess what I'm saying is there's kind of a fine line with the 3 year stuff between just being absolutely sort of made up out of thin air kind of and or being kind of edgy side of wise. And we would argue that you should try to just be on the edgy side of wise. You know, you want to stretch, but you also want to put some things out there that if God was to move through the means of your work, that you would see these things happen. Now, I know some people are like, well, where are you getting the vision for that stuff? Is God just popping it in your head? And this goes back to some of the theology we have around will of God. Some things can happen like that. I mean, I'm not taking that off the table. God can do whatever he wants. We don't feel like we have to wait on that word from God. We feel like we have enough direction in the scripture. Every single thing I'm going to list on here, like, for example, I'll just give a couple examples. You know, we have in our 3 year vision that our Mercy Hill Espanol campus would have its own building. Mm-hmm. Well, say people might say, well, did God just pop that in your head? Is it like a God dream? And it's like, well, no, we believe God loves Hispanic people that speak Spanish. We believe that God's growing that ministry. We believe that their ministry would be greatly served if they had their own space that doubled their seating capacity, and they would continue to grow. And so de facto, we're going to put a 3 year goal that they would have their own space, you know? So it's a little more like that than it is just sort of dreaming and praying that God's going to whisper something in our ear, not sure if it was God or if it was the burrito that we ate the night before. So we have a lot of things that are like that.
Let me say this real quick. But a lot of what you're doing though here is if you kind of get in your heart what that longer term vision is. So for us, it's, you know, man, 5,000 baptisms by 2032 and send 500 people out, right? And I think when people hear that, people could just be like, okay, well, that just needs to be your goal, right? You just need baptism goals and like sent goals. And it's like, no, what you got to do is like, okay, let's think about, man, 10 years from now, if that actually were going to happen, what would have happened? What are some other things that would have, and it's like
happened along the way?
Yeah, there probably is like, man, these big organizational changes that are going to happen, and like, man, there's going to be financial stuff, right? That's going to, people are going to have to buy into the vision, and the vision's going to have to be clear, and that's a lot of what you're doing in this exercise. You're kind of reverse engineering and saying, like, going back to the very beginning where I was like driving across the country, right? Like, you're basically saying, man, if I'm going to drive all the way across the country, like at, day 2 or day 3, you're going to have to be able to say, hey, I made some progress, right? I hit Texas at some point. I hit Arizona at some point. That's kind of what you're doing with this.
Yeah, and I think that I mentioned it on the last podcast, but so we went a little more creative this year because it was a big year. We're resetting a 3-year vision. We had just done this, right? So we did a 3-year vision, 22, 23, 24. Praise God. Most of that stuff is either off the board or about to be. Like we said, we missed a couple of them by a few weeks, but we're getting close. And so this year, re-upping that 3-year vision of what it looks like to get to the 10-year. I had a business guy in our church give me a book called Vivid Vision. And, man, I really was compelled by it. And the idea there, to your point, in Cameron Harrell's book is that you would pick that day in time 3 years from now, and you would just kind of put yourself there, and you're sort of looking back on all the things that happened to get you to the goals that you want to have. And so I think that's a good way to think about it is, with the 10-year, what would have happened in the next 3 if we actually were to get to the next 10? And our guy that helps us with the OS, which you don't have to have EOS to do these things. This is just, it's his thought work, it's dreaming, it's vision. But he would keep saying, is that critical? Meaning if it doesn't happen, it really derails us off of the 10-year. Because it's easy to just start throwing cool stuff on the board. We want to do this ministry and that ministry. Of course, we want to have this much money and we want to have... But it's like, oh, no. Like we have a revenue goal. Our revenue goal for the next 3 years is $43 million. And, it's like, that wasn't just out of thin air. Me and you, we talked about that a ton. Right. Because we're trying to figure out, well, to get to the 10-year, we need X amount of things to happen in 3. And for those X amount of things to happen in 3, it's going to cost X amount of money. So it's just continually saying what would have happened if we were to actually hit 5,000 in baptism.
It's the same thing with
sent ones.
The baptism goal. Like we have in the next 3 years to go over that 3,000 mark in terms of baptisms. We just went over the 2,000 mark. And it's basically just, it's exactly what you're saying. Like, yeah, maybe we don't hit 3,000, maybe we're less or maybe we're more, but to by 2032 to hit 5,000, in the next 3 years, we're going to have to be pretty close to that 3,000. Right. And if we're not, then it's like, okay, man, this is kind of a marker as we go. We're probably not on track to.
Yeah, something's got to drastically change if we're gonna, if we're gonna be able to hit that. Let's walk through a couple more of these just in terms of what some of them are. I know people may have some questions around that.
Yeah.
We really believe that our Clifton campus is going to need new kid space if we're going to hit that 10-year mark of the 5,500 because we're going to need to see the growth in that campus. That's one. We believe we're going to need to see 750 people have gone out on Go teams in 1 year. Now, whether that's 2026 or 27, I'm not totally sure. I don't think it's going to be 25, but we need to see that happen in one of those years. We really believe that we need to have 300 community group leaders by that time. And that's a big deal because that all pushes towards the baptisms, right? Like if we get drastically behind on our community group structure, then that whole idea of 10 to 1, 10 to 1, 10 first-time guests to 1 baptism, 10 baptisms to 1 sent one is just going to all break down, because we're going to not see the baptisms that are coming out of the first-time guests if we don't have a place to disciple them. And so we're thinking about where do we think our attendance needs to be? What kind of group structure do we need for that attendance? And it ends up being 300. Another thing that we really feel like in the next 3 years that's going to be huge if we can do this for that baptism goal and that particularly that sent one goal is to have our retreat center phase 1 done. We feel like the problem with adult discipleship is we stopped going to youth camp, and so we want to try to solve that problem. So I've got a bunch more in here, but those are the types of things that are 3 year for us. Now, we are a church that's running 3,500 and, millions of dollars of budget, whatever. The great thing about this is it scales up to the church that's 10,000 and it scales down to the church that's 100 or 200.
Certainly.
Because no matter the idea of a longer term goal, the 3-year rocks, getting into the 1 year and 90 days, I just think it's easy for guys to roll their eyes and to say, well, that's easy for y'all to do because, you're a bigger church. And it's like, no, this is really one of those things where I think that anybody, unless you're an alien, that doesn't need to do any kind of vision execution stuff, it's going to greatly help no matter what stage you're in terms of your church.
And I would say some of this stuff is actually probably more important if the church is smaller, because when the church is smaller, it may be easy to think about some of those like ministry numbers, like you were saying. We want to see X amount of people this or X amount of people this. But some of the changes that are going to need to happen if God does bless the church and adds to the church, some of the changes are going to be organizational changes. And so like, I will add some of the 3-year stuff. I would say maybe a third of the ones that we have in here, they're organizational changes. Like over the next 3 years, one of the ones we have is our worship academy will be thriving. And our worship academy is basically a way to get younger people introduced to playing instruments, to leading worship, so that, one of the challenges when you're church planning is, that new church planner, they don't have a band, they don't have a system for that.
Right.
And that we can actually send out, full bands with the churches that we plant. That's sort of an organizational thing, right? It's not like a X amount of people doing this. Same thing with some of those like revenue goals and even goals in terms of cash flow. Like, man, for us to be able to do some of this stuff, we're going to have a certain amount of cash that we will have accumulated over the next couple of years. We have one on here, EOS fully implemented. And EOS is just sort of a system that we use. There's lots of different systems out there, but we realize like, man, the more people we have on staff, there's going to have to be sort of a organizational change so that we're all pointed in the same direction. Like the more people you have, the more volunteers you have, you can have people pointing in all sorts of different directions. And so some of those organizational goals are just as important as anything when you're thinking about what needs to happen over the next 3 years. So from there, I would say you get to maybe the most challenging part of any sort of planning process. And this is where I do really believe that having some sort of system, some sort of process that you're using is very helpful, because if you don't, what you end up doing is, we have, how many things do we have on this 3 year?
Well, we on our 3 year, we have 29, but that's not where it's going to stay.
So we're going to reduce it.
We're going to have to continue to do the work to get it down to 15.
Right. So from there you say, okay, what are some things we want to focus on next year? And I think it's important to kind of say what we're saying and what we're not saying. By giving you these, 5 to 7 things we're going to focus on next year, this is not the only stuff we're doing, right? There's just so much to ministry. You're gonna preach every week and write a message. There's people that you're gonna counsel. There's gonna be weddings. There's gonna be funerals. There's so much going on. But what you're doing by having some specific goals is you're saying like, yes, that whirlwind of stuff is always going to be going on. Like that's just part of life. We need to make sure that there's some things that we focus on no matter what. Mm-hmm. So we need to go from, 3 years from now, we imagine all this stuff happening and this is where God is going to bring the church, to then saying, okay, for that to happen 3 years from now, and we're semi-confident if that happens 3 years from now, we'll be able to see our vision beyond that, 10 years from now or 5 years from now, what actually needs to happen in the next year. And so for us, this was I don't know how long, this is probably a 4-hour or 8-hour process.
Right.
We've done this so many different ways across the years, but this year we had 7 people, and then actually a consultant that was working with us. So 8 people in the room, 4 to 8 hours, and we landed on, how many do we have? 7 things that we want to focus on for 2025.
Well, it's 8. We're supposed to have 7.
Okay. We have 8. We started with, 50. A ton. Yeah. And it's a hard process. What we've done.
People get their feelings hurt.
Yeah, because some people like have
Right.
like, I really think we should do this. And we're like, no, we're not going to do that.
And it's under their ministry, and they're not doing their job if they don't advocate for it.
Right.
Right.
Or we have too many, and we've done this in the past, where it's like, man, we can't take any of these off the list. But then what happens is you get to the next year, and it's like, we did like 6 of the 12 because we just had too many. There's too much of that whirlwind stuff that's happening that you can't plan for. That's always happening. So I would say this is kind of the sweet spot of the whole thing. Like if you're fairly confident in that 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, this is where the rubber meets the road to like, man, what you really need to focus on over the next year. So you want to talk about like just the challenges of that, why this works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've done this in varying ways throughout throughout our 10 or 12 years. We've always had a 1-year goal. And what I always said was, hey, it's not the 90%, it's the 10%. 90% of what we do is whirlwind stuff. It's going to be in and out. It's discipling kids. It's student ministry. It's it's just all the stuff, going on mission trips. It's preaching sermons. But we want to have emphasis, and I think that what this does is it really kind of it brings to the surface. Yeah, but how do you bring what you want to emphasize in line with where you're trying to go over 3 years, which is in line with where you're trying to go over 10 years. And man, I think it was a great process. It was probably the most robust one I've been a part of, because I think in years past we sort of wimp out and just put too many things down.
Right.
Well, we did that again. We had 8. We're supposed to only have 7. You're supposed to only have like 5 to 7 or something. But yeah, I mean, for us, I just think that these things are so important for us to accomplish, what we want to see. For example, we want to grow by 20% in our age-based ministry in the next year. Well, why? Well, that's so important for that 500 sending. I mean, we're starting to have been here long enough now where it is the kids that we meet as kids that are starting to graduate college now and staying around and coming to City Project and all that. And so continuing to pump that age-based ministry is going to end up, that's where our church planners, that's where our worship leaders are going to come from to send out. This year we're going to be launching the Ridge, and so we have a goal around that.
That's our new kind of home and hub.
That's right. We have a goal around Easter, doubling our attendance and stuff on Easter this year. One of the things I think is important that you could talk about, because I feel like you had a little bit of an aha moment with this during the meeting, is that some of these things are geared more toward, they are mission critical to hit the 3-year. And some of them are mission critical, but they're also critical for vision casting around what we're trying to do for the 3-year and the 10-year, So like, I'll give you an example. For me, having a numerical goal around our Easter services this year is very important for me, because I feel like it ties in so much with what we're trying to do in the 5,500 in terms of seeing that the attendance is the lever that you pull between baptism and eventually sent one, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas I think that some of these things are just more critical in terms of we need to get a new campus for Espanol this year. Mm-hmm. That's more concrete. It has to happen if we're going to continue to grow. So, some of it is vision. Some of these things are real anchor points for vision. Some of these things are, man, they have to happen if we're going to continue to grow and be able to hit our 3-year goals.
Yeah, I think maybe the aha moment for me was like, and we had to just kind of work through all this stuff, is some of them are like mission critical in terms of like one of the ones of our 2025, we have launched the Mercy Hill Worship Academy. Part of our 3-year goals is the Worship Academy is going to be thriving, right? And something can't be thriving if it doesn't exist. So like it's mission critical that it's launched this year. Other things are mission critical that we talk about them, because it's not just about like the actual things that you do, but a church is a nonprofit, the majority of the people that we're trying to move, they're not on our staff, Right. It's like we have to inspire them. We have to cast vision. And so there are things that it took us working it out, but there were things that you felt like, man, this like has to happen, but and I was like, I don't know that's mission critical for like, it actually has to happen in the organization if we're going to hit the 5,500. But I think the aha moment was like, no, it has to happen in terms of like, we got to keep this vision in front of people.
And celebrate it. What you celebrate, you replicate.
Right.
To be able to talk about it, and the way to do that is to keep it in the goals.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So once you act, this is a tough process of, it needs to be that probably 4 to 7. Hey, right. Based on where we're going 3 years from now, based on where we're going 10 years from now, there's these, 3 to 7 things that we need to focus on.
And this is a little different than Vision Frame, because Vision Frame only gives you 4. And so I think
really 1 for the upcoming year.
Well, no, I'm talking
4 for the 3.
Yeah, you're right. 4 for the 3. It's 4 and then 1, and I do feel like that is, having done it, I think it's fine, but it also can. This feels a little more realistic, and that feels a little more restrictive. So right. So let's just review real quick. So you're talking about, we got 1 10-year goal. You got 15 or so 3-year goals
where you're painting a picture.
Yeah, it's a goal / what's it going to feel like?
Yeah.
What has to happen to hit the 10-year, right? And then for 1 year, you have 4 to 7. And then we're going to get into the rocks for 90 days. Yeah.
So up until this point, I would say all you've done is like planning, right? And you can have just like wonderful planning, and if you don't execute on it, the planning's kind of all for nothing.
Right. It's a dream, pipe dream.
Yeah. You're maybe going to do a little bit better just because you have all this in your mind or have all this in your heart, but it's not really going to affect anything. Any organization that we would look to say, man, there's something, like they're really doing something. Any business, nonprofit, whatever, it's because they're executing. Like they're, the reason we all want to, if we're going to go eat fast food or whatever, it's like, man, let's go to Chick-fil-A. Because
well, I like Subway.
Okay, let's go to Subway.
Seafood
I don't know
sensation,
about that. I actually like Subway too. But Chick-fil-A is going to execute. Like you just know they're going to execute,
Right.
Like if you go to Chick-fil-A, vast majority of the time, even if there's a long line, it's going to be pretty quick. They're probably going to get your order right. Like they're just going to execute on what it is they're trying to do. You may go to another restaurant and you just know, like your kids may want to go there, but you're like, I know they're going to mess the order up.
It'll take forever, yeah.
I know they're going to say, hey, pull ahead and go park here and we'll bring it out in a little bit, and it's not going to be right. And so going from what the actual goals are to like, how do we execute on that? I mean, that is where, that's just where it's going to happen.
Right.
So coming out of here is where, part of, we use EOS, but any good system should do this. 4 Disciplines of Execution. That's a good book. How do we systematically hold ourselves accountable to what we say we want to do? So it's not just holding others accountable. Like, how do we hold ourselves accountable to what we say that we want to do in the upcoming year? So here's what we do coming out of this. Before we finish the planning, we said, okay, here's these 8 things that we're going to go after in 2025. What are the things that we have to do in Q1 of 2025 so that we're making progress towards these things? And what we end up doing is, some of these are organizational, like, hey, this has to happen for the organization. And then these are going to make their way down to many of the employees in the organization. Like, hey, I got 1 to 2 things I'm trying to do this quarter because it's going to help the church go after these big goals.
Right.
And the magic of this is you actually assign them to people. So we create, hey, here's what needs to happen over the next 90 days, and who actually is responsible for that? Because what can happen is, man, we have these 8 things that we want to do, and then we just kind of go from there, right?
Right.
No one is actually responsible for it. And so if it goes really well, we don't know who to give the credit to. If it doesn't go well, it's just kind of like, man, we're hoping these things will happen. But actually assigning them to people, hey, I'm doing this. Somebody else on our leadership team is doing this. And then what happens is we have week-to-week meetings where we're able to say, man, how are these things going? So talk about that process of going from like, hey, here's the big rocks to like what needs to actually happen in the next quarter.
Well, I think that this is the part that has really helped us a ton with, the fact that you guys have a meeting every week, and that meeting you have to verbalize, is my rock on track or off track? And I mean, honestly, it goes back to that book, Tribe of Millionaires, which is, again, accountability is like a very biblical issue. But that concept of just the fact that I got to be there and I got to say out loud whether it's on track or off track is an incredible motivator to make sure that it's decently, on track and going to be something that we execute on. I think that these planning processes help primarily for us. This is not everybody else, okay? But for us, I think this stuff helps the very most at the very top end and then this very bottom end. Mm-hmm. The very top end is, do you have something that you are fresh in your mind going after this 10 years out? And I think this is, I think these planning processes have really helped us with that. And then I think the other big help for us in our organization, and you obviously have a closer eye on this, but just from what I see, it does feel like getting the stuff out of the meeting and into the day-to-day happens because of that, once a week, having a talk and talking about issues and all that kind of stuff. And just having a place to do that where you just, because it's there and it's rhythmic, and it's not everybody's funnest thing, I'm sure, but it just seems like issues are going to get resolved way faster and rocks are actually going to happen because people have to talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, is that what you're there every week.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. Because a lot of times, if you go back to like the book 4 Disciplines of Execution, they talk about like kind of input output type goals,
Right.
You could have a personal goal in your life, right? It's the new year. I want to lose 20 pounds. That's kind of like an output goal. You don't fully control that, but you have a lot of influence on, what you're going to weigh. So an input goal, a lot of times we just have the output goals and we don't actually create input goals, Like an input goal could be like, I'm going to drink more water. I'm going to drink 30 ounces of water every single day. That's something you can control, right? Like no matter what, you can drink that amount of water every day and somebody can actually hold you accountable. They can say, Andrew, tell me over the last 7 days, how much water have you drank?
Right.
That's a lot of what this is creating. Like, okay, let's break this down into really bite-sized pieces, stuff that we actually can control, and then let's hold each other accountable to execute on it. So like one of our 1-year goals is, by the end of the year, is to have a new campus for our Espanol campus. That's a big goal. That's a huge goal. We got to find a new space and all this stuff. And that's one of those things, like if you don't break that up into smaller bite-sized pieces, like it's just probably not going to happen.
Right.
So I only have one quarterly rock that was assigned to me. And it was, I'm going to identify 3 potential spaces for the Espanol move. So we're not going to get the building. We're just going to, hey, the starting place is going to be to identify 3 potential options in quarter 1. Because if that don't happen in quarter 1, it's very unlikely that they're actually going to be in a new space by. So what's going to happen, and that our leadership team does a 90-minute meeting every week, and every other team for the organization does the same 90-minute meeting, but just for their team.
Right.
The leadership team meeting is for the organization as a whole. There's a part in that meeting where we get to our company rocks, we get to the individual rocks, and we just go around. And like you said, there's no discussion. What we say is, we're going to get to all right, Bobby, identify 3 potential spaces for Espanol move. I'm literally just going to say on track, or I'm going to say off track.
Well, which is it right now?
It's off track. Yeah.
I mean,
most of them start off track.
Yeah, because you haven't really started doing anything with it yet.
A lot of people are going to want to say like, well,
it's on track.
Yeah.
What have you done? Nothing.
Until I get to March, I'm just going to say it's on track. But for the most part, it just starts as
and that will you will out. You'll get outed if you're that
Yeah.
If you're really.
Yeah. Because
no, let me ask you this. So there's the rocks. The 90-day rocks are like 3 to 5.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? 3 to 5 or something like that?
3 to 7, yeah.
Okay, so it's still less. You're probably going to have less of those, or at least maybe.
It's not a ton of them.
Definitely not more than the 3 year. Or I'm sorry, than the 1 year.
No.
Right, and so you have these rocks that are, and let me give. I thought this would be a good example, just of the discussion, right? So, because you just gave one that's like, man, this has to happen right now. I was advocating that we would put the permitting process for the retreat center to be. Started
mm-hmm.
in the first quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a big discussion around that because you only get, I thought it was even less. I thought we're only going to do like 5 rocks or something. Okay.
It's not going to be a lot.
And so but basically what ended up happening was finally the question was asked, to Randy, hey, can you start that permitting process, whatever it is, March 17th is our next meeting. Can you start that after March 17th and still get it done by the end of the year? And he said yes. And so it was like, well, okay, it's not going to be a rock.
Right.
So that's kind of how the discussion goes. We got to get these 7 or 8 things done for the year. So what do we need to do right now to line that up?
Yeah, because going back to like that input output, I've just seen this so many times. You have a very faith driven, optimistic person, which is great to be. They have a goal for their ministry, or they have a goal for whatever. And if you don't have some more bite-sized piece, kind of smaller goals, and you go say, Andrew, how's it going? They're gonna be like, it's going great. It's going great. But like, you're not really measuring like, man, I'm never going to get to here if I don't hit this first.
Right.
And so what ends up happening, they spend most of the year just be like, it's going great. I think we're going to hit it. It's going great. And then you get to the end of the year and they're like, man, we didn't hit it.
It's like when we were talking to those guys at Austin Stone years ago, and they're like, whenever somebody just tells you like, man, they're crushing it, it's like, like, man, they don't really have a system for figuring out if someone's actually doing real great or not. You know? And same thing here. It's like, hey, how's your stuff going, man? We're crushing it. Well, how do you know that? Well, I need to have some ways to know that based off of these rocks.
Yeah, I was talking to my wife about this. To me, it's just really helpful. Like once you do the bigger planning, once you do the 3-year, once you do the 1 year, day to day, the funny thing is, and this is why a system like this is really helpful, you're not even thinking of day to day, you're not even thinking of the 1 year, because all you're thinking of is your rock. Right. It could be overwhelming, right? For me to just like every day to come into the office and look at these huge things for the year, but I don't need to think about that. Like all I need to think about is like, hey, the people on this leadership team, they each have a rock, and I have a rock myself, and that's what I need to focus on. Right. And if I focus on that, and if I give that my energy, then hopefully when quarter 2 starts, man, we're going to be further ahead than we were. It just helps you not kind of get overwhelmed, not take on too much, but not take on too little either.
Well, that's good, man. Well, dude, I think we leave it there. This has been a good discussion. We are going to, at some point in the future, do one of these that is kind of how you bridge this stuff into your personal life. A lot of times pastors are better at leading their flock than they are leading their family, and so we want to talk about that. But hey, guys, we do have events coming up every single quarter. Man, the last event we had, Rich Birch came in and did an incredibly just absolute masterclass on church and marketing and how to speak the language of people that are wanting to will eventually be the type of people that come to your church. And so that's the type of things we're offering. You can check out all of that on breakinggrowthbarriers.com and see when our next one-day event is. Thanks a lot.